Welcome back to the Only You podcast. This is your host, Lo Jackson. This is our second season over here at the Only You. And things are going great. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. Thank you for following me. Thank you for giving me 5 stars over there at Spotify. I do appreciate you all. This month is July, and we're doing Harriet Beecher Stowe. What an interesting person. Quite a talented writer, abolitionist. She actually had a remarkable family, and 2 of her siblings were also famous writers and abolitionists as well. She started actually writing for money. Her husband's salary as a professor was not large enough, so to help support their growing family, Harriet honestly became a writer. That's when she started writing, and it really actually took off because she used real insight throughout her life during the Civil War of things that are now gone and we speak no more of, and people don't talk in the ways they used to back then with more of a British accent, but now it's like a southern twang. Kind of an interesting person, and her first works were published in 1843, shortly before the birth of her 5th child, after which she spent 15 months recovering from exhaustion. She actually was quite a young lady. I think her father and her mother wound up having 11 kids, and they spent a lot of time around the table. These kids were involved in pretty much like real lawyer talk and things of the times that were going on. So the exposure to actual litigation terminologies and certain things like that as kids brought these kids up to be way talented in the writing area. She drew ideas from personal experiences, such as part of the it's part of the reason Uncle Tom's Cabin became such a success was the pugnancy with which she described the pain of tearing apart families. She described it so detailed, and hopefully what little bit I did share with you guys, you kind of get the gist of the times and the atmosphere and the way that it was going, because I stopped right where it started to get really good, honestly. It's a long read, but it is well worth the read. Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was a prolific author, although mainly remembered for Uncle Tom's Cabin. I've shared several of Harriet's 50 years of writing with you during this past month. She's done short stories, essays, poems. And thank you guys again for following me. Thank you for sharing me. Such a delight to see people email, people post on my polls when I do have them out there. I appreciate that stuff. This ain't the greatest podcast in the world, but I'm building it. What money I do make from this podcast, I actually put right back into the podcast. Like I bought that microphone. It was from all you listeners, honestly. So hopefully you hear me better and it ain't such a, static in the background or whatever it was. This is July, and it is Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. Thank you guys for being outstanding citizens. Thank you for being all the wonderful people of the world that do great things out there. All of us go through certain things in life, and honestly, we forget to check in sometimes to see honestly how we're doing as a human being. Are we on board with ourselves? Are we still checked into our lives? Are we showing up where we need to show up? Or is every room in the house a disaster? The lawn needs mowed. It's been needing mowed for 3 weeks. The dogs are doing their duties too in the living room, And I know that sounds crazy, but I've actually known people that have done that and have gone through that in life. They actually got really depressed, and unfortunately that friend of mine ain't no longer here. He's the reason why I started this podcast, and he suffered from rampant mental health issues due to his drug habits and addictions and stuff. And I think that mental health is important. I suffer from mental health issues as well as everybody else. Fatigue, we all go through procrastination. That's a mental health problem too. Those are certain things we do and habits that we have are actually formed by years and years of doing the same things repetitively, and then them having a certain outcome that we didn't expect but was the outcome that the world had in mind due to the biology of everything, the way it goes and the way things are made. And it happens to go sometimes in a negative direction, which in turn makes people have mental health issues, and we need to be aware of schizophrenia, stress disorder. You got to be aware of dementia, frontal lobe dysplasia. You could have Lewy body syndrome. You could have Suter-Barbara effect. You could have all kinds of different things, with the brain that are crazy. I said Suter-Barbara effect. I thought about a cousin of mine. He was 19 years old, and he had gotten into a fight with my uncle because they were living together at my grandma's house at the time, and he left angry that day, and I can see his face in my mind, and he left angry, and honestly, he was doing so many terrible things at the time and he had been getting arrested and getting in trouble and stuff, but he was just a lost individual that had some negative upbringing and some really high stresses put on a little kid that made him actually go from being dressed up like a Barbie doll every day to being totally gothic Marilyn Manson'd out, which that night he left, he wound up going to a different town, and then almost 9 months later, my uncle came inside and he said, "You guys, we need to go to the hospital." He said, "I just read the paper." He's like, "I put two and two together." He said, "We've been wondering where he went. Well, now I know." And we went into the hospital. I walked in with him, and there my cousin was with pipes coming out of every orifice, his brain, his head, his eyes. And my cousin was talented, but unfortunately he decided that he wanted to worship the devil instead of the Lord, and he started actually really doing rituals and running around town trying to get other people to follow him. And maybe other people were actually getting him to follow them. I don't really honestly know, but he suffered from mental illness so much at that time. Nobody had any idea back in the mid-90s about mental illness. I'm sure people did, but it wasn't as apparent as it is now, that we got to look out for one another and you got to see signs. It's like when they are training you on a job, you're trained at that thing, and then all of a sudden somebody comes along, you see them do something they're not supposed to. Would you tell them they're being unsafe? Same difference. I would. I'm like, "Dude, you're being unsafe." And back then in the 90s, nobody was telling people, "Hey, you need to be thinking about what you're doing, saying, and being, because you're actually committing to a life you have no idea about that's full of mental illness and dead ends." And unfortunately, sometimes some of us get there and it's too late. But this is the Only You podcast. I like to share books, and I like to share authors that I feel are worthy, that they've actually had mental health issues and they've went through certain things in their lives that all of us go through, even though they were here 100 years ago telling you certain stories that they had made up, and some of them are true, and some of their theories are still used today of the people that I have shared with you. But I'm doing this for mental health purposes and for the greater good of information being passed on to other people that maybe they didn't have any idea about, and maybe it'll change somebody's life. I don't know. I do appreciate you, and I love hearing back from you when you chime in on my polls and email me or tell me in person when you see me about my podcast and how silly I am. But thank you guys. Harriet Beecher Stowe actually met President Lincoln in 1862. Some 11 years after the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet was involved in a meeting with President Lincoln in Washington, D.C., and accounts by her daughter stated that the meeting was quite a joyous occasion, and her son later reported that the president had jokingly referred to Harriet as the little woman who wrote the book that started the Great War. Is that not wild? Uncle Tom's Cabin is a wonderful read. You guys need to get out there and check it out, honestly. It'll keep you on the edge of your seat. She was a wild, wild writer, honestly. And just her brain and the power behind it and the way she put words and theories and situations together made her, she's so a force to be reckoned with, even today in the writing world. I'd put her up against Stephen King any day. Seriously. Even though he writes scary books, but whatever. Harriet Beecher Stowe actually campaigned for women's rights following the Civil War. Harriet began campaigning the expansion of the rights of married women, especially springing given the era. She compared the position of a married woman to that of a slave, pointing out that neither could hold property, keep money, or have any legal rights at all. Harriet may have contributed to her sister Isabella's strong feelings about women's suffrage. Both women actually lived in Hartford, Connecticut at the time, and Isabella continued the fight, eventually succeeding in getting a bill passed that gave property rights to married women. And that was something that, Harriet Beecher Stowe fought for too, was women's rights, and she was a person and a force to be reckoned with, like I said earlier, because she was just so well-rounded, and all of her writings, meetings, teachings, her body language was always on point. I've read in several different places when people would say, hey, she came into a room. It wasn't like, hey, she came into a room and nobody's seen her. No, she came into a room and lit it up every time. And it didn't matter who was in the room, if they were poor, rich, or middle class, or what it was. She created an integrated school. She set up an integrated school in the town of Mandarin, Florida, where her family spent their winters. It was one of the first in the country that promoted equal education for all students. Harriet's brother Charles strongly believed that education was the key to integration and encouraged her to help him in his endeavors to teach emancipated children and adults. And he actually went on to become quite famous in his writings as well, and that's her brother, Charles. She wrote a tourism guide. Harriet loved Florida so much that she wrote a promotional book depicting Florida as an ideal place to vacation, which it is. And if you ever get a chance, go to Destin, Florida. I spent a week there, and back in 2011, and I remember this little 6-year-old came over to me, and he said, try this, the sandal whistle between your toes. And he put his little feet together and started scooting his feet back and forth really fast in the sand. And sure enough, it was whistling, so I did it, and sure enough, my feet started going in the sand. I couldn't believe it. So I had asked the gentleman that was I think he was a lifeguard or something out there, but I asked him, how is it possible? And he said, it's white quartz, so the quartz in your feet actually make a whistling sound because of friction. And I'm like, that makes sense. Kind of cool. But thank you guys for listening to the Only You podcast. I know I'm annoying sometimes when I get on little tangents like that, but hey, what's it like to be an inspiring writer? Well, Only You podcast fans, it's hard to put into words. Best joke I could come up with. What's the difference between a freelance writer and a large pizza? A large pizza can actually feed a family of 3. Now, let's get into this latest read by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Thank you, Only You podcast fans. This is OldTown Fireside Stories by our favorite author this month. That's Harriet Beecher Stowe. Here it is, The Ghost in the Mill. Come, Sam, tell us a story, said I, as Harry and I crept to his knees in the glow of the bright evening firelight, while Aunt Louise was busily rattling the tea things, and Grandmama at the other end of the fireplace was quietly setting the heel of a blue mixed yarn stocking. In those days, we had no magazines and daily newspapers, each reeling off a serial story. Once a week, the Columbian Centennial came from Boston with its slender stock of news and editorial, but all the multiform devices, pictorial, narrative, and poetical, which kept the mind of the present generation ablaze with excitement, had not even an existence. There was no theater, no opera. There were in OldTown no parties or balls except perhaps the annual election or Thanksgiving festival. And when winter came, the sunset went down at 4:30 and left the long dark hours of the evening to be provided for. The necessity of amusement became urgent. Hence, in those days, chimney corner storytelling became an art and an accomplishment. Society then was full of traditions and narratives which had all the uncertain glow and shifting mystery of the firelight hearth upon them. They were told to be sympathetic audiences by the rising and falling light of the solemn embers, with the hearth crickets filling up every pause. Then the aged told their story to the young. Tales of early life, tales of the war and adventure, of forest days, of Indian captivities and escape, of bears and wildcats and panthers and rattlesnakes, of witches and wizards and strange and wonderful dreams and appearances and providences. Can any of you remember telling stories like that when you were kids? I can remember me and my brother would always make up stories in the dark and tell each other before we would go to bed. Those were fun days, fun times, and I'm sure they were for you too. In those days of early Massachusetts, faith and credence were in the very air. 2/3 of New England had then darkened unbroken forest through whose tangled paths of mysterious winter wind groaned and shrieked and howled with weird noises and unaccountable clamors. Along the iron-bound shore, the stormful Atlantic raved and thundered and dashed its moaning waters as if to deaden and deafen any voice that might tell of the subtle life of the old civilized world and shut us forever unto the wilderness. A good storyteller in those days was always sure of a warm seat at a hearthstone and the delighted homeridge of children, and in all OldTown there was no better storyteller than Sam Lawson. Do tell us a story," said, pressing upon him. Do tell us a story," said Harry, pressing upon him, and opening very wide blue eyes in which undoubting faith shone as in a mirror, and let it be something strange and different from common. "Wall, I know lots of old strange things," said Sam, looking mysteriously into the fire. "Why, I know things that if I should tell, why people might say they wasn't so. But then they is so full all that. Oh, do tell us." "Why, I should scare you to death, maybe," said Sam doubtingly. "Oh, pooh. No, you wouldn't." We both burst out at once. But Sam was possessed by a reticent spirit and loved dearly to be wooed and importuned. And he only took up the great kitchen tongs and smote on the hickory forestick when it flew apart in the middle and scattered a shower of clear bright coals all over the hearth. "Mercy on us, Sam Lawson," said Aunt Louise in an indignant voice, spinning round from her dishwashing. "Don't you worry a grain, Miss Louise," said Sam composedly. "See, that our stick was even a most in two, and I thought it'd just settle it." "I'll sweep up the coals now," he said, vigorously, applying a turkey wing to the purpose as he knelt on the hearth, his spare lean figure glowing in the blaze of the firelight and getting quite flushed with exertion. "There now," he said, when he had brushed over and under and between the fire irons and pursued the retreating ashes so far into the red, fiery citadel that his finger ends were burning and tingling. That are done now as well as Hipsy herself could have done it. Ours sweeps up the hearth. I think it's part of the man's business when he fires a fire. But Hepsy's so used to seeing me a doing it on't that she don't see no kind of merit in it. It's just Parson Luthrop said in his sermon, folks allers overlook their common mercies. But come, Sam, that story, said Harry, and I coaxingly pressed upon him and pulling him down into his seat in the corner. Lord of mercy, these here young'uns, said Sam. There's never no contending on them. Ye tell them one story and they just swallows it all up like a dog does a jab o' meat, and they're all ready for another. What do you want here now? Now the fact was that Sam's story had been told us so often that they were all arranged and ticketed in our minds. We knew every word in them and could set him right if we varied a hair from the usual track, and still the interest in them was unabated. Still we shivered and clung to his knee at the mysterious parts and felt gentle, cold chills run down our spines at appropriate places. We were always in the most receptive and sympathetic condition. Tonight, in particular, was one of those thunder and stormy ones when the winds appeared to be holding a perfect mad carnival over my grandfather's house. They yelled and squealed around the corners. They collected in troops and came tumbling and roaring down chimney. They took and tattled and buttery door and sink room door and the cellar door and the chamber door, and a constant undertone of squeak and clatter, as if at every door we, a cold, discontented spirit, tired of the chill outside and longing for the warmth and comfort within. Wild boys, said Sam confidently, what y'all have, tell us. Come down, come down. We both shouted with one voice. This was in our mind, and number one among Sam's stories. You mustn't be frightened now, said Sam paternally. And thank you guys again for listening to the Only You podcast. And hopefully you're enjoying this read by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Fireside. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this wonderful read by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She is our author in the month of July. And here we go. Oh no, we aren't frightened ever, said we both in one breath. Not when you go down to the cellar, arter cider, said Sam with severe scrutiny. If ye should be down at the cellar, the candle should go out now. I ain't, said I. I ain't afraid of anything. I never knew what it was to be afraid in my life. Well, then, said Sam, I'll tell you, this is what Captain Eb Sawin told me when I was a boy about your bigness, I reckon. Captain Eb Sawin was a most respectable man. Your grandfather knew him very well, and he was a deacon in the church in Dedham afore he died. He was at Lexington when the first gun was fired against the British. He was dreadful smart man. Captain Eb was the driving team a good many years atween here in Boston. He married Louise Peabody. That was cousin to your Granther, then that's grandfather, I'm assuming. Louise was a real sensible woman. And I've heard her tell a story as he told her, and it was just as he told it to me. Just exactly. And I shall never forget it if I live to be 900 years old. You see, along back then times, there used to be a fella come around these air parts, spring and fall, peddling goods. Had his pack on his back, and his name was Jehiel Lodium. Nobody rightly knew where he come from. He wasn't much of a talker, but the woman rather liked him and kind of liked to have him around. Women will like some fellows when men can't see no sort of reason why they shouldn't. And they liked this air Lodium, though he was kind of mournful and thin and shade-bellied and had nothing to say for himself. But if it got to be so that the woman would count and calculate so many weeks before 'twas time for Lodium to be along, and they'd make up ginger snaps and preserves and pies and make him stay to tea at the houses and feed him on the best there was. And feed him up on the best there was. And the story went round, and he was courting Phoebe Ann Parker, and Phoebe Ann was courting him. Folks didn't rightly know which. Well, all of a sudden, Lodium stopped coming around, and nobody knew why. Only just he didn't come. It turned out that Phoebe Ann Parker had got a letter from him saying he'd be along afore Thanksgiving, but he didn't come, neither afore nor at Thanksgiving time, nor arter, nor next spring. And finally, the women then again up looking for him. Some said he was dead, some said he was gone to Canada, and some said he'd gone over to the old country. Wow, as to Phoebe Ann, she acted like gallows since married Bijah Moss and thought no more about it. She took the right view on and said she was certain that all things was ordered out for the best, and was just as well folks couldn't always have their own way. And so in time, Lodium was gone out of folks' minds, which as of last year's apple blossom. It's really affecting to think how little these here folks is missing that so much sought by. There ain't nobody these ever so important, but what the world gets to going and without them pretty much as it did with them, though there's some little flurry at first. Well, the last thing that was in anybody's mind was that they ever should hear from Lodium again. But there ain't nothing but what has its time turning up, and it seems his turn was to come. Well, you see, 'twas the 19th of March when Captain Eb Sawin started with a team for Boston. And Captain Eb Sawin, he started with that team there to Boston that day, and there come about the biggest snowstorm that there had been in them parts since the oldest man could remember. 'Twas this here fine sifting snow that drives in your face like needles, with the wind that cut your nose off and made teaming pretty tedious work. Captain Eb was about the toughest man in them parts. He spent days in the woods logging and been up to the district o' Maine lumbering, and was about up to any sort of thing a man generally could be up to. All these here March winds sometimes does set on a fellow so that neither nature nor grace can stand 'em. The captain used to say he could stand any wind that blew one way time for 5 minutes, but come to winds that blew all 4 pence at the same minute, why, they flustered him. And hey, audience members, you can tell by the dialect in this book. It's actually very hard to read and speak if you're not aware or around it all the time, this type of dialect. While that was a sort of weather, it was all day. And by sundown, Captain Eb, he got clean bewildered so that he lost his road. And when night come, he didn't know nothing where he was. You see, the country was all under drift, and the air so thick with snow that he couldn't see a foot afore him. And the fact was, he got off the Boston Road without even knowing it, and came out at a pair of bars nigh upon Sherburne, where old Cack Barrow's mill is. Your grandfather used to know old Cack boys. He was dreadful drinking old critter that lived there all alone in the woods by himself, attending saw and grist mill. He wasn't allers just what he was then. Time that Cack was a pretty considerably likely young man, and his wife was a very respectable woman, Deacon Amos Pentgale's dater from Sherburne. But you see, the year after his wife died, Cack, he get up going to meeting Sundays, and all the tithing men and select men could do, they couldn't get him out to meeting. And when a man neglects means of grace and sanctuary privileges, there ain't no saying what he'll do next. Why, boys, just think on it. An immoral critter lying around loose all day Sunday and not putting on so much as a clean shirt when all respectable folks has on their best clothes and is to meet and worshiping the Lord. What can you expect to come of it when he lies idling around in his old weekday clothes fishing or some sitch? But what the devils should be after him at last, as he was after old Cack. And like the Bible says, idle hands of the devil's workshop, everybody. And that's what he's getting at in this part of the story, or she is in this part of the story. Here Sam winked impressively to my grandfather in the opposite corner to call his attention to the moral which he was interweaving with his narrative. While ye see Captain Eb, he told me that when he come them bars and looked up and saw the dark coming down and the storm thickening up, he felt that things was getting pretty considerably serious. There was a dark piece of woods on ahead of him inside the bars, and he knew come to getting there the light would give out clean. So he just thought he'd take the hoss out of the team and go ahead a little and see where he was. So he drive his oxen up again the fence and took out the hoss and got on him and pushed along through the woods, not rightly knowing where he was going. Wow, afore long he see a light through the trees. Sure enough, he come out to Cack Sparrow's old mill. It was a pretty considerably gloomy sort of place that our old mill was. There was a great fall of water that come rushing down the rocks and fell into a deep pool, and it sounded so wild and lonesome. But Captain Eb, he knocked on the door with his whipple hand and got in. There to be sure sat old Cack beside a great blazing fire and his rum jug at his elbow. He was a dreadful fellow to drink, Cack was, for all that there was some good in him, for he was pleasant spoken and obliging, and he made the captain welcome. You see, Cack, said Captain Eb, I'm off my road, and I got snowed up down by your bars, says he. Want to know, says Cack, calculate you'll just have to camp down here till morning, says he. Wow. So old Cack, he got out his tin lantern and went with Captain Eb back to the bar to help him fetch along his critters. He told him he could put them under the mill shed, so they got the critters up to the shed and got the cart under, and by that time the storm was awful. But Cack, he made a great roaring fire, because you see, Cack allers had slab wood aplenty. With his mill and a roaring fire is just so much company. It sort of keeps a fellow's spirit up. A good fire does. So Cack, he sat on his old tea kettle and made a swiggling lotto toddy, and he and Captain Eb were having a tolerable, comfortable time there. Cack was a pretty good hand to tell stories, and Captain Eb wasn't no way backward in that line, and he kept up his end pretty well, and pretty soon they was a roaring and a howling inside about as loud as the storm outside. When all of a sudden, about midnight, there come a loud rap on the door. Hopefully everybody's enjoying Old Town Fireside Stories by Miss Harriet Beecher Stowe. Wall, says old Cack, if 'tis the devil, we'd just as good's open and have it out with him. To aunt, says he, and so he got up and opened the door, and sure enough, there was old Kerchie there. Expect you'd heard old Grandma tell about old Kerchie. She used to come to meetings sometimes, and her husband was one of the praying Indians, but Kerchie was one of the raw wild sort, and you couldn't no more convert her than could convert a wild cat or a panther. Lordy massy. Kerchie used to come to meeting and sitting there on them Indian benches, and when the second bell was a-tolling, and when Parson Larthrop and his wife was coming up the broad aisle, and everybody in the house rise up and stood, Kerchie would sit there and look at him out the corner of her eyes, and folks used to say she rattled them necklaces, old rattlesnake tails and wild cat teeth, and such like heathen trumpery, and looking for all the world as if the spirit of the old serpent himself was in her. I've seen her sit and look at Lady Lothrop out of her corner of her eyes, and her old brown baggy neck would kind of twist and work, and her eyes, they looked so that 'twas enough to scare a body. For all the world, she looked just as if she was a-working up a spring at her. Lady Lothrop was just a kind to Kerchie, as she always was to every poor critter. She'd bow and smile as graciously to her when meeting was over, and she'd come down the aisle, passing out a meeting about Kerchie never took no notice. You see, Kerchie's father was one of them great powwows down to Martha's Vineyard, and people used to say she was set apart when she was a child to the Sarvice, so the devil. Anyway, she never could be made nothing of in a Christian way. She come down to Parson Larthrop's study once or twice to be catechized, but he couldn't get a word out of her, and she kind of seemed to sit scornful while he was talking. Folks said if it was in old times, Kerchie wouldn't have been allowed to go on so, but Parson Larthrop's so sort of mild, he let her take pretty much her own way. Everybody thought that Kerchie was a witch. At least she knew considerable more than she ought to know, and so they was kind of afraid on her. Captain Eb says he never see a fella seem scareder than Cack did when he see Gertrude a standing there. Why, you see, boys, she was a withered and wrinkled and brown as an old frosted pumpkin vine, and her little snaky eyes sparkled and snapped, and it made ye head kind of dizzy to look at them. And folks used to say that anybody that Gertrude got mad at was sure to get the worst of it, first and last. And so no matter what day or hour Gertrude had a mind to rap at anybody's door, folks generally thought it was best to let her in, but then they never thought her coming was for any good, for she was just like the wind. She came when fit was on her. She stayed just long as it pleased her, and went when she get ready, and not before. Gertrude understood English and could talk it well enough, but always seemed to scorn it, and was Ayler's mo win and muttering to herself in Indian and winking and blinking as if she saw more folks round than you did, as that she wasn't no way pleasant company, and yet everybody took good care to be polite to her. So old Cack asked her to come in and didn't make no question where she come from, on what she come on, but he knew it was 12 good miles from where she lived to his hut, and the snow was a-drifting above her middle, and Captain Eb declared that there wasn't no track, nor sign no track of anybody's coming through that snow next morning. How did she get there then? Said I. Did you never see brown leaves riding on the wind? Well, Captain Eb, he says, she came on the wind, and I'm sure it was strong enough to fetch her, but Cack, he got her down into the warm corner, and he poured her out a mug of hot toddy and give her. But you see, her being there sort of stopped the conversation, for she sat there a-rocking backwards and forwards, a-sipping her toddy and a-murmuring and looking up chimney. Captain Eb said in all his born days he never heard such screeches and yells as the wind give over that chimney, and old Cack got so frightened you could fairly hear his teeth a-chattering. But old Captain Eb, he was a pretty brave man. He wasn't going to have conversation stopped by no woman witch or no witch. And so when he see her murmuring and looking up chimney, he spoke up and says, "Hey, well, Gertrude, what do you see?" says he. "Come out with it. Don't keep it to yourself." You see, Captain Eb was a hearty old fella, and then he was a little warmed up with the toddy. So Captain Eb, he was a little drunk. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this great read. I came across this, and this is one of the best ones I found, Old-Time Fireside Stories. Thank you for listening to the Only You podcast. Again, you guys, head over to Spotify, give me a 5-star review. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for sharing me with a friend. I do appreciate the audience increase. I have seen it. That is cool. And I think I had 1 5-star review, so it's going down. We just became best friends. Whoever you are that put that out there, I know it was you. Oh, magic fingers. You guys, thank you so much again. And hopefully you're enjoying Harriet Beecher Stowe, and this is July. This is Minority Mental Health Awareness Month, so if you see anybody out there that's a minority and they're acting a little funny, a little crazy, you know, maybe they're actually mentally ill, maybe they're going through something that you have no idea about, maybe they're depressed, maybe they suffer from autism, maybe they don't have the funds that they need to get the medicine or medications. You know, if you have a friend that's a doctor that's willing to do side work, you know, because doctors can. You know, doctors can do what they want to. They don't have to just go through their practice, you know. I know plenty of people out there that, you know, use friends as doctors to get more of a diagnosis than you can get from going to a doctor that sees 50 people a day, get you in and out as fast as you can, because, you know, we're addicted to medical in America. Insurance is everything here because it's a huge moneymaker. And they care more about you making your insurance payment than them paying for, you know, your open heart surgery. So at the end of the day, you know, you got to weigh your odds and options. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed Old Town Fireside Stories. hopefully you'll run out there and check this book out by Harriet Beecher Stowe. You know, it is a great read. It was published in 1872. And there's more to this story. That was just the beginning of it. And I like to share the beginning of stories with you guys because it's not on me to read you the whole story. I kind of like, oh yeah, that'd be great if I did that. But then again, it would not be encouraging somebody to better themselves and become something more. Because if you're not putting in the effort, you're just going to procrastinate and not do it. You know, like Mel Robbins says, if you don't do it within the first 5 seconds, you're probably not going to. Your mind gets lazy and things take over and you forget what you're doing and all that good stuff. But again, thank you guys so much for sharing me. This has been awesome. It's been a great day. It's been a great weekend, honestly. It's beautiful here in Illinois. Charleston, Illinois, Mattoon, Illinois, just the central southern Illinois, even down south to southern Illinois. It's a great, beautiful area, especially with all the valleys and gorges. You can see where the glaciers like cut through, you know, the side of all this rock that's here in the limestone and all the slate and different types of rocks that are in Illinois. It's a beautiful time of year here. All the crops are full grown. The corn's 12 feet tall. You know, we're going to have a great season this year. We were thinking it was going to be a drought, which, I mean, I'm pretty sure it's still kind of a drought year, but we've had a lot of good rains here lately, and that's important to feed the world because that's what we do here in America. We help feed the world, as in Mexico does too. I once seen a map, and it was like a pretty much a heat sink map of where all the foods are grown in the world, and the United States and Mexico were so lit up, and all the other places in the world were very dim in color. It was pretty interesting. But thank you guys again for listening. Thank you for reading, and thank you for being aware of Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. And again, I do appreciate each and every one of you, and hopefully you can reach one, teach one, and go out there and change somebody's life. One little kind step of the way. Every day that you go out, you know, you're out there to put yourself out there to be kind to somebody. You know, not everything has to be division and closed off like the systems and the news and the TV has done to us. I can remember a time when it was okay to have a friend over for supper, and your friend loved being around your family, because sometimes as a kid when you sit around the table and you see other people's families interact and you learn all these different things, they grow up and they actually do that same thing with their kids. Maybe they didn't do that stuff at home. Maybe they had a parent that worked odd shifts and their mom worked odd shifts or whatever, but children are like sponges, and they will absorb many different things that you bring around them, and some of those things you don't want them to absorb, but they will, and in time they'll come out, as they always do. Again, thank you guys for following and listening. I do appreciate it, and it's been a great read, and hopefully you'll rush out there and pick up OldTown Fireside Stories by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And this month coming up is going to be an exciting month, August. I cannot wait. And that's just around the corner. And hopefully you've enjoyed Harriet Beecher Stowe this month. I had done Leo Tolstoy, Mark Twain before. I did William James, Pragmatism. What a great guy. What a wonderful mind. I've done so many different podcasts here in the past that I've learned so many different things about so many different authors. I've actually tried to reach out to some authors and, you know, get them to respond, but it's actually very hard to get an author to respond to you. And so far this season, I've done The Power of Positive Thinking by Dr. Vincent Peale. I did The Prophet by Kilian Gabron. How to Stop Worrying and Start Living by Dale Carnegie. That's an awesome read, and you should reread that one. I did The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Animal Farm by George Orwell, which that book has a lot to pertain to what's going on in the United States right now, honestly. I did The Art of War by Sun Tzu, which, if you have never read The Art of War, get out there and get that book. It will change your life. I did You Can Analyze Handwriting by Eric Holder, and I found that one to be really unique because it can tell you a lot about a person's handwriting and what they're thinking and feeling at the time that they sign certain things. I did The Mind and the Brain by Alfred Binet. The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And Adam Smith is one of the best writers I've ever. I'm thinking about doing him in the coming months as one of the monthly authors, because Adam Smith was really important in the United States and just for America overall. I did Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. If you don't know who Viktor Frankl is, he was a Holocaust survivor, and A Man's Search for Meaning, it is so deep. The intricacy that Viktor Frankl puts into, the life living as a Holocaust survivor, it's wild, because he was a psychologist and a doctor. He was very, very educated over there. I did The Conduct of Life by Ralph Waldo Emerson, Pushing to the Front by Orson Marden. I love this one. This is one of my favorite books I've ever read, and that's Games People Play by Eric Berne. And that's where I get the fog from. Fear, obligation, and guilt. That was actually something that Eric Berne had made up as a psychologist and used throughout his time and studied. Criminal Psychology by Hans Gross. He's the founding father of criminal profiling. And I did The Kabbalion by William Walker Atkinson. The Art of Money Getting. That was a good one. I really enjoyed doing P.T. Barnum. He was an interesting guy. Phineas Taylor. Hopefully you've picked up some of these books that I've kind of introduced you to, or maybe you actually knew about them and forgot about them, because sometimes I come across books that I didn't realize I had already read, then I'm like, oh man, I remember reading that 20 years ago, duh. But this is the end of this wonderful read. I do love Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's one of my favorite authors. And OldTown Fireside Stories. There's a bunch of different great stories in there. So hopefully everybody out there will check it out, read it, maybe learn some stuff and pass it on. Again, thanks a lot. And this is the Only You podcast. And this is your host, Lo Jackson. And I will be coming to you soon with another great read by Harriet Beecher Stowe.